Welcome back, friends. So in that previous video, we talked about function arguments. So in this video, we're going to talk about the last fundamental piece of JavaScript functions, and that's the return keyword. So in this lesson, we're going to learn the return keyword because up until this moment in functions, we've used console.logs. But now we're going to return some values from the functions that we write. So I like to think of functions like a machine. Write a function and take some inputs, and those would be the arguments. And then it does something with those inputs. It checks to see if a user is logged in. It calculates BMI, and then it returns something in the end, right? As a result, it returns an output. So far, functions have only taken inputs in the experience of this course, and they actually haven't sent anything back. So I'll show you what I mean. So I'm going to write my cube function again. This function takes an argument. I'll say number as an argument. And so what we did inside this function was console log the number times number times number. Now I'll call this function and we'll just put in 4. So when we look at the console, we see that the number 64 is here. So it looks like I do have an output. But what I actually have is something being printed to the console, right? You get my drift. With console.log, that's what happens. That's what you do. That's the way it is. But I don't actually have something that's being returned, do I? There is a really big difference. If I use the return keyword, it means that I can store the value that's coming back out of the function. Right now, can't store it. Sure, a console.log just prints a value to the console. I won't be able to use that in any other part of my code. So to be able to use the values that come from a function, we need to use the return keyword. And to use that, all we need to do is write return instead of console.log. Why couldn't I have just said that from the beginning? Now you get the process, though. So the return keyword is going to return one output for a function. Now, theoretically, we could have multiple return statements, but only the first one is actually going to run, unless we had some sort of if statement. But still, only one of these is ever going to actually return. So that means in this case, we're returning the number times number times number. Now I run this cube of 4 and go to the console. And here we see nothing. Why? Well, we didn't console log the result of the function. So let's return to our code. And here I'll say console.log. And then inside of it, I'll say cube 4. Now we're going to console log the result of this function. So I go to the console, refresh the page, and now we can see our result here. Okay, so now let's have a look to see things more clearly about what we're doing. I'm going to store the result, right? Because that's what I said the purpose of this is. So I'm going to store the result of this function in a variable. And then I'm going to console log that variable. So I'll say var num, and then I'll call the cube function with 5. And then here, before the return keyword, we wouldn't be able to save it in a variable like this, right? Just be printing it. So now down here, I'll say console.log, and inside of it, I'll say this is num variable, comma, and num. Now I go to my console and refresh the page, and here we see this is num variable 125. So I'll go back to my code editor. So you see, every function returns something, and if we don't explicitly tell it what to return, it just returns undefined. Okay, so now let's talk about the other important issue, which is that we can just return one output from a function. So we'll see another example to just really understand what I'm talking about here. Actually, I'm not going to make another example. I'm just going to change this function a little bit. So here, I'll say if number equals 25, then inside of it, return 25. Otherwise, return number times number times number. You follow? See, so now if I call this function with 25, then it's going to return just 25. And then it's going to quit from the function. It's not going to move on to the next line. So I call cube with 25. Now our code starts to run. We look at the if statement, and here we check to see if the number's 25. Sure enough, it is. We're going to return 25. And like I said, it's not going to move on to the next line. Now, after we run our first return statement, we quit the function immediately. So to see the result here, I'll say console.log. This is another console, and then num. And I go to the console, refresh the page, and yeah, we see just 25 in our console. So let's have a look at the code again. So we didn't run this code here after we ran the first return. So if I don't return anything here, if I delete 25, then when we look at the console, here we see the undefined. So if we don't return a value, then our function returns undefined. Okay, so let's return to our code. And now, why don't we make another example? So I'll say function calculate age. So in this function, we're going to calculate the age, and this function is going to take an argument while we call it, and I'll say birth year. Okay, so what we're going to make here in this function is we're going to return 2020 minus the birth year. Okay, so after that, I'm going to want to store that value that gets returned from our function in a variable. So I'll say var age, and I'm going to call the calculate age function with 1992. Now to see our result, I'm going to say console.log. This is the age and comma and age. And now I go to the console, and sure enough, here we see the age. So now I'll go back to my editor. Why don't we do another example? I'll say function enter cafe. And this function is going to take an argument called age with capital A. And inside of it, I'll say if age is less than 18, then return you cannot enter the cafe. Otherwise, return you can enter the cafe. So here, we're not going to console log anything. We just return a string. So just so that we're clear here, these statements are string. So now let's call enter cafe with 17. So when we run our code, we look at this if statement, and 17 is less than 18. So we're going to return this string, and then our function stops after the first return statement. Now let's store the output of this function in a variable called cafe. Now let's console log this variable. So say console.log cafe, and when we look at the console, here we see you cannot enter the cafe. So like I said, the return keyword stops the execution of a function. So as soon as we return something, the function is done. So that means that the whole point of a function is that it takes some sort of input and then it returns to us something. So as soon as it returns, well, that's the end of the function's execution. Okay? Great. So why don't we take a quick pause, digest all that, and we'll continue in the next section.